As the power of the state has steadily increased, the power of the human race for deadly mischief has increased at the same time. We have all been told that the modern era, with its emphasis on democracy and freedom, has liberated the individual more than any previous period. We are taught to scoff at the notion that a king, Führer, duce, or party could be morally or intellectually infallible. Instead, we believe that a government of the people is a clear improvement, that the majority, especially when we are part of it, can do no wrong. To suggest otherwise would be to admit that we and our neighbors are just as prone to ignorance and greed as any king or emperor. But if this is all true, then why are we witnessing the largest and most oppressive state apparatus the world has ever known? If we are more free than ever before, why is the state more powerful than ever before? In this video, we seek to answer this question. As in all things, the power of illusion holds sway. The belief that democracy naturally equates to greater freedom blinds us to the reality that the state has steadily grown in reach and control under democracy. Dispelling this illusion is necessary if we wish to preserve liberty. As Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote, "If the power of government rests on the widespread acceptance of false, indeed absurd and foolish ideas, then the only genuine protection is the systematic attack of these ideas and the propagation and proliferation of true ones." If one wishes to trace the rise of state power, one should follow the history of wars. It is in war that the true extent of the state's power becomes visible, from the levies it imposes on the populace to finance its aggressive expansion, to the total mobilization of entire societies to fight its battles. Bertrand de Jouvenel, writing in 1949, observed that war is the health of the state. If we arrange in chronological order the various wars which have for nearly 1,000 years ravaged our Western world, one thing must strike us forcibly, that with each one there has been a steady rise in the coefficient of society's participation in it, and that the total war of today is only the logical end of an uninterrupted advance towards it, of the increasing growth of war. In other words, each successive conflict has drawn more deeply from the resources and energies of society, bringing the state closer to total control over the lives of its citizens. During the time of Napoleon, conscription was introduced on a large scale, and while it required military-age men to serve, it did not take everyone. Napoleon often called up only a portion of eligible men, typically a fraction of each age group, allowing many to continue their civilian lives as long as they paid the necessary taxes to support the war effort. However, the scale of his conscription was unprecedented at the time, leading to the creation of a massive army. By contrast, under the French King Louis XIV, conscription as we understand it was virtually non-existent. Armies during his time were composed mainly of professional soldiers, volunteers, and mercenaries. The average person outside these groups had little direct involvement in the wars, though they still bore the financial burden through taxes and the economic disruptions caused by conflict. Even in periods of European history often described as being stricken by near-constant war, such as the 11th and 12th centuries, the armies were actually relatively small, and the campaigns typically short. During these times, kings relied on the feudal obligation of their vassals, who were required to provide military service, usually for a set period, often around 40 days. After this, vassals could return to their own affairs. Kings could call upon militias or hire mercenaries, but these forces were often limited in size and reliability, making it difficult to sustain prolonged campaigns without the cooperation of their vassals. During the Middle Ages, war was a small-scale affair because the state itself was a small-scale affair. It lacked the two crucial tools needed for expanding its power, the ability to conscript individuals and to levy widespread taxes. As Bertrand de Jouvenel notes, throughout the monarchy's reign, it never dared to conscript its armies. Instead, soldiers were funded directly from the treasury, meaning that the reach of the state was limited to what it could pay for. The growth of state power, defined as its ability to control more aspects of a nation's activities and resources, is directly tied to the expansion of war. It is only in democratic societies that the state has found the means to extract the maximum amount of resources from the population. As de Jouvenel observes, when the people upset the power of kings, it was, so they thought, of just these burdens that they were ridding themselves. It was the burdens of taxation and, above all, military conscription which they hated. That being so, it is not a little surprising to see these burdens grow heavier under an up-to-date regime, and most surprising of all, to see conscription instituted, not by absolute monarchy, but as the result of its fall. Throughout history, the burden of conscription has grown heavier with each successive war, spreading like a contagion to nearly every Western state. Bertrand de Jouvenel observed that conscription has often followed closely behind its counterpart, universal suffrage, the one placing in the hands of every adult person a voting paper, the other putting on his back a soldier's knapsack. How very strange! When their masters were kings, the peoples never stopped complaining at having to pay war taxes. Then, when they have overthrown these masters and taken to taxing themselves, the currency in which they pay is not merely a part of their incomes, but their very lives. Once a state gains the ability to conscript its citizens for war and impose greater taxes, its neighbors must either follow suit or face the disadvantage of being unprepared. De Jouvenel likens this dynamic to a pair of duelists who mirror each other's moves. Nations at war copy each other's total methods, until no individual is left untouched and no resource is left unexploited. The consequences of this relentless imitation were laid bare in the 20th century, a period that claimed millions of lives and squandered the labor of countless others, even perverting the advances of science toward destruction. This return to a primitive society on the warpath was no accident. It was the logical result of a centuries-long process of increasing state power. As long as we continue to hand over more of ourselves to the state, no matter what benevolent face it wears, we may be paving the way for ever more devastating wars, each more destructive than the last, until we finally wage a war that sees the destruction of everything we hold dear. During the time of the monarchy, people protested every increase in taxation, and the king rarely dared to conscript his subjects. But today we accept these demands with little resistance, whereas a king risked his position, and sometimes even his life, if he took too much from his subjects. In those earlier times, authority was embodied in the figure of the king, who made direct demands on his people, and with that authority came responsibility. But in a democratic system, these demands seem to come from a distant, faceless power. Where once people could point to a king or prince as the source of their troubles, now they speak of a vague and ominous they. It is they who raise our taxes, they who mobilize us. This shift is a product of the smokescreen the modern state has drawn around itself. The common people no longer see the mechanisms at work, no longer protest, no longer react. In this way, the modern democratic state has brought to fruition the work that the monarchy began. This reality fundamentally contradicts the popular narrative of our time, that we are more free than ever before, and that democracy has brought an era of peace and justice. It stands as one of the great contradictions of history. The reason for this lies in the persistence of false and misguided beliefs, one of the most pervasive being the idea that the people are the sovereign. But in truth, power is never wielded by the majority. It always resides in the hands of a minority. As James Burnham succinctly put it, political power is always exercised by a minority, and the majority is always ruled. According to de Jouvenel, the power of the modern state is not rooted in fear, but in a sense of partnership. Representative government carries the implication that those in power act as servants of the general will, wielding the authority of the collective. This means that when we obey the state's demands, we believe we are, in essence, obeying ourselves. De Jouvenel argues that this piece of unconscious self-deception makes everyone complicit in the expansion of state power. If the people is always right, and the state is the people, then there can be no danger in surrendering into the hands of its mandatories complete, uncontrolled, and irrecoverable power. The concept of popular sovereignty creates a dangerous illusion. By claiming that the state's will comes from a collective being, the nation, of which rulers are mere instruments, we have constructed a fiction that makes the expansion of power not just acceptable, but desirable. This idea has taken root in the minds of many, as leaders eagerly reinforce it. As de Jouvenel notes, they well understand its usefulness to them in making their power or their tyranny acceptable. The fiction of representative government dismisses the possibility of a true defender of the people, because this so-called representative is viewed as embodying the people themselves. Against this construct of the popular will, the individual is left defenseless, unable to oppose the general interest as a counterweight. If a ruler's authority is derived from the general will, he can issue any command he wishes, and the subject is compelled to obey absolutely, for each individual is considered the author of the ruler's actions, as their collective representative. What this means fundamentally is that the expansion of power is not solely the result of deceit by those in power, because we are all complicit in its growth. Authoritarianism always relies on widespread complicity. The logical conclusion of the social pact is that there exists a right of command to which the private individual has no recourse. The so-called power of the people is, in reality, only tenuously linked to the people, like an umbilical cord connecting them to the general election. In truth, it is a power over the people, a power made all the stronger because it derives its authority from this fragile connection. In reality, they are citizens for a day and subjects for 4 years. Power of the people. This confusion of thought is at the root of modern despotism. In a system of popular sovereignty, we are told that in obeying the state, we are merely obeying ourselves. This idea dissolves the traditional barriers between rulers and the ruled, making resistance to state power not only difficult, but conceptually incoherent. It blurs the line between individual liberty and political freedom. In declaring the sovereignty of the people, individuals gain the power to choose their rulers, but little else. This notion of popular sovereignty creates a circular logic in which the individual has no rights left to assert against the collective will, now embodied by the state. One of the paradoxes of democratic systems is that despite their rhetoric of liberation and representation, they often suppress individualistic tendencies within society. While democracy claims to free individuals from the constraints of old power structures, it simultaneously centralizes power and limits divergent interests. As the representative of the so-called general interest, the state seeks to suppress any interest that diverges from this unified vision. It aims to compress society into a single homogeneous whole over which it can exert control. As the representative of the general will, all divergent interests impose direct limits on its power. Through its rhetoric, the state pursues this suppression while claiming to serve the greater good. Appeals to the greater good and general will allow democratic power to stifle those who seek autonomy, all while maintaining the appearance of acting in the public's interest. Democratic powers, like all forms of power, resist attempts by regions or groups to assert autonomy or independence. What makes democratic power unique, however, is its ability to justify this centralization through appeals to the general will or the greater good. These concepts are used as justifications to override the desires of minority groups or regions seeking greater autonomy. This exposes the lie at the heart of democracy. In practice, democracy becomes a power over the people, rather than a true power of the people. As Hans Hermann Hoppe notes, the state operates in a legal vacuum. There exists no contract between the state and its citizens. With the rise of political parties, sovereignty has effectively shifted from the people to the political machine. Elections have become merely a way for the people to place themselves under the control of a small gang. As the political machine grows stronger, party lines are drawn, and genuine debate becomes irrelevant. Since rational thought is not widely practiced by the masses, appeals are made to emotions instead. While not everyone is trained in the discipline of rationality, no one is immune to emotional responses. Each party stirs up hope, trust, and affection for itself, while inciting indignation and hatred against its opposition. By opening the prospect of power to anyone ambitious enough to seek it, democracy has made the expansion of state power much easier. When anyone could potentially become a minister, no one is inclined to destroy a position they may one day hold, nor to limit the power of a state machine they hope to command in the future. This creates widespread complicity in the extension of power within a democratic system. The political party is born from this competition for power. In the resulting chaos, people increasingly crave leadership by a strong, decisive will. Eventually, the time comes when a single man or a small group seizes control of the political machine and bends it to their own purposes. It is only after a would-be tyrant takes over that the crushing power of the state becomes fully apparent. These individuals, however, did not create this vast apparatus of oppression. They are merely, as de Jouvenel notes, its bad tenants. Democracy, then, in the centralizing, pattern-making, absolutist shape which we have given to it, is the time of tyranny's incubation. The system built in the name of the people becomes the perfect tool for tyranny when it falls into the wrong hands. According to de Jouvenel, most political doctrines focus only on the outward appearance of power, failing to grasp its inner nature. Power is not a substance that can be fused with a nation. It has a life of its own, nor does it reside in any rightful purpose or reason. At its core, power is command, and as such, it can only exist for its own sake. While the characteristics of power may change over time, its fundamental nature remains constant. It is driven by egoism. Some argue that republicanism solves the problem of democracy by instituting laws that protect the individual from the majority. This is only partly true. A government of laws is still a government of people, and laws, no matter how well crafted, cannot fully contain the nature of power. Power always usurps authority. Power, in its essence, is not a static force, but a dynamic entity with an inherent tendency to expand. This expansionist nature is rooted in the egoistic impulses of those who wield it. Power, in this view, is not satisfied with maintaining the status quo. It constantly seeks to grow. Because of this, power will subvert any doctrine, even one designed to limit or restrain it. Republicanism may offer protections, but it cannot change the fundamental truth. Power, by its nature, will push against all constraints. Modern ideological notions of freedom and democracy have not restrained state power. They have, in fact, only strengthened it. Power is authority and makes for more authority. It is force and makes for more force. Or, if a less metaphysical terminology is preferred, ambitious wills drawn by the lure of power expend unceasingly their energies in its behalf, that they may bind society in an ever tighter grip and extract from it more of its resources. De Jouvenel's analysis of power draws some interesting parallels with Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. In fact, I'll explain it in terms of Nietzsche's idea. Nietzsche argued that the fundamental drive in human nature is not merely self-preservation, but a relentless striving for growth, expansion, and self-overcoming. This will to power, as Nietzsche conceived it, goes beyond a mere desire for political or social dominance. It is a deeper psychological impulse that fuels all human action and creativity. As Nietzsche put it, life is an instinct for growth, for survival, for the accumulation of forces, for power. The egoistic nature of state power can be seen as a collective manifestation of the individual will to power. Those in positions of authority are driven by a deep psychological impulse to expand their influence and push beyond their limitations. The growth of power is not just the product of rational decision-making or a response to external threats. It is an expression of a primal human drive. Individuals and institutions that wield power become vessels for this psychological force, acting as channels for its relentless pursuit of dominance and growth. De Jouvenel argues that in every station of life, a man feels more complete when he is imposing his will, using others as instruments to fulfill his grand designs. To rule a people, what an extension of the ego is there! De Jouvenel compares this sensation to the pleasure of atrophied limbs returning to life, but even that pales in comparison to the unmatched delight of directing an immense human mass with a mere gesture. The power to prompt the distant movements of a multitude of unknown people, with nothing more than the trace of a pencil or a spoken command, gives a man a profound sense of influence. In his mind's eye, he sees the canal being dug along the line he has drawn, the boats that will soon glide along its waters, the villages springing up on its banks, and the bustling metropolis filled with goods and human activity. All monuments to his agency, each a testament to his far-reaching influence. The orders he gives move as quickly as the thoughts he thinks, setting in motion the gears of a vast machinery. With every command, rivers are redirected, lives are altered, and entire landscapes are bent to the will of one man, or a few. This extension of the ego leads to what Nietzsche calls intoxication, a state of heightened power and agency, where a person experiences an exhilarating sense of being a prime mover in the world. In this state, one becomes acutely aware of their ability to shape events, influence others, and bring their vision into reality. It's a heightened consciousness in which the individual's will seems to transcend their physical boundaries, impacting lives and events far beyond their immediate reach. There is a universal need to exercise some kind of power, or to create for oneself the appearance of some power, if only temporarily, in the form of intoxication. This intoxication is marked by a seamless fusion of thought and action, where ideas swiftly translate into tangible consequences. The person feels a godlike sense of creative force, exerting control not just over their environment, but over the destinies of others. It's a sensation where one's influence appears limitless, where command and outcome blur into a single fluid motion of power. I do not mean to suggest that those in authority are inherently different, nor that power itself is a corrupting force. Rather, it is that each individual's will to power constantly collides with others, hindering its expansion. Within a larger entity, these myriad wills converge under a unified set of strategic objectives. My idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space, and to extend its force, its will to power, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. But it continually encounters similar efforts on the part of other bodies, and ends by coming to an arrangement, union, with those of them that are sufficiently related to it. Thus they then conspire together for power, and the process goes on. Those who make up this collective body come to identify their own ego with it, feeling a sense of causal potency as it grows and extends. In Nietzschean terms, this signals to the organism that its will is functioning in a healthy, vigorous way. The will to power is defined by its natural drive to assimilate and evolve, constantly seeking out and incorporating other forces to strengthen itself, expanding through this process of integration. Moreover, individual forces are often drawn toward a superior will because by aligning with it, they experience an increase in their own power and capacity to achieve their aims. This convergence of wills under a larger banner is not simply an act of submission, it's a recognition of the enhanced agency and reach that come with aligning oneself with a greater force. In this way, the individual finds a more expansive role within a collective, much like how the ruler's ego in de Jouvenel's analysis extends across the entire body politic, making every action of the state feel like an extension of personal will. In this way, the interplay of wills to power is not merely a process of domination and subjugation, but a complex dance of collision, convergence, and mutual empowerment, all in the pursuit of an ever-expanding sphere of influence. The ego, subsumed into the greater whole, experiences the triumphs of the collective as its own, even as it contributes its part to further the overarching agenda. As de Jouvenel observes, the impulse is nourished by all the egoisms, great or small, noble or sordid, which taken together make up the egoism of the state. In a monarchical system, as the ruler's influence expands, the governed populace becomes an extension of his ego, their joys and pains merging with his own. The subjects are no longer mere pieces to be moved around. Instead, each one becomes a living cell in the body politic, their sensations intimately linked to the ruler's directing mind. In this way, the egoism of power stretches its tendrils throughout the social mass, until ruler and ruled become indistinguishable. A secure and lasting hold on power cements this identification, allowing the ruler's egoism to be fully absorbed into the general welfare. In contrast, the more tenuous or fleeting grip on power within a democratic system encourages the exploitation of the nation as an instrument of personal ambition. Here, the governing ego resists dissolution into the collective, seeing the state not as an extension of itself, but as a tool for achieving its own goals. The state, with its monopoly on force and seemingly boundless reach, has often been seen as the embodiment of evil, a Leviathan to be resisted and dismantled. This perception has inspired countless revolutionaries, determined to liberate humanity from the yoke of oppression. Yet history is not without its ironies. The great revolutions of recent times, though driven by the desire to curtail the state's dominion, have paradoxically served to strengthen it. As Lenin observed, through all the innumerable revolutions which have taken place in Europe since the end of the feudal system, this bureaucratic and military machine has developed, improved, and strengthened. Every revolution of the past has done no more than improve the government machine, when its real task was to smite and smash it. This is not to suggest that we should bow before the altar of the state or passively accept its unchecked growth. The state's capacity for destruction is reason enough to advocate for limiting its power. However, to portray the state as an inherently malevolent entity is to engage in a mythologization that obscures the true nature of the problem. If our aim is to safeguard liberty and curb the state's encroachment on our lives, we must first free ourselves from the illusion that this can be achieved through mere laws or tinkering with governmental structures. The will to power operates at a level far deeper than the superficial trappings of politics. What the concept of the will to power reveals is that the only effective check on the state's power is the existence of independent bodies with a will to power strong enough to resist the state's advances. Our task, then, is not to tilt at the windmills of state power, but to cultivate and strengthen the institutions and associations that exist independently of the state, to nurture within them a resolute will to power that can stand as a bulwark against the state's totalizing tendencies. Only by accepting the reality of power, rather than attempting to wish it away, can we hope to preserve the precious sphere of individual freedom. As Bertrand de Jouvenel writes, "Liberty is not our more or less illusory participation in the absolute sovereignty of the social whole over the parts. It is rather the direct, immediate, and concrete sovereignty of man over himself, the thing which allows and compels him to unfold his personality, gives him mastery over and responsibility for his destiny."